Actually, I'm going to start with a story from that is told in that Travels to Hallowed Ground, Total War and Apricot Jam. When Americans go to war, they usually fight in someone else's country. Soldiers go to combat overseas and later join the veterans of foreign wars. The vast majority of Americans come no closer to a war zone during wartime than the atlases they consult to find out where in the world are such places as Palermo, Peleliu, Pusan, Pleiku, and more recently Korangal, Kabul, and other places in Afghanistan. To be sure, British redcoats marched about North America during the Revolution and even sacked Washington during the War of 1812. But British armies were never very large in those days, and relatively speaking, Walter, what the damage they did was of short duration. The great exception to this American rule of wars was, of course, the Civil War. And with few exceptions, war zones of that conflict lay in the American side. The American Civil War also marked a significant step in the evolution of total war. And here we get edge into insurgency. Wars between peoples instead of restricted to armies, as they were in the 18th century, or supposedly were in the 18th century. Consequently, Southern civilians were some of the world's first peoples, or Western civilization, European peoples, to endure the dangers and devastation of campaigns waged directly against morale and economic resources. Morale and economic resources are abstract terms. In Southern memory, the advent of total war usually invokes more concrete memories. And let me offer a personal example. Located about 20 miles east of Richmond in King William County, Virginia, in the Tidewater, is a place called Chestnut Grove, where 6 generations of one branch of my family have lived. The house is old, built in the 18th century, as initially 1 over 1 over 1. An English basement and then a main floor and then bedrooms upstairs, and then gradually added on, and my wife and I have committed the atrocity of adding still more. But it's definitely a home place as opposed to an ancestral seat. It's a farmhouse and won't be anything else. During the late unpleasantness, Union cavalry frequently raided the countryside around Chestnut Grove, so much so that the family had a prescribed drill through which they went whenever the Yankees came near. My great-grandfather, and that's frightening to realize how old I am, great-grandfather, Andrew Macon Pollard, who was then a boy, I don't know, 10 so, had the job of herding the livestock, or as much as he could herd, down into a place called the Old Level, which was way back in the woods, in a swampy region near Mancoon Creek. One time, when he returned from this errand, he realized he came back and found that the Yankees had indeed come, and they had broken into the smokehouse and taken as much meat as they could possibly carry, and more meat than they could possibly eat. As a consequence, as they rode away, the blue-coated horsemen hacked off hunks of ham and bacon with their sabers, and this is probably where it gets into lore, because sabers are not really that good at hacking off hams. But anyway, the story goes that they hacked off the ham and the bacon and dropped it in the dusty road as they rode away. No doubt they considered this a legitimate act of war because they were depriving the enemy of food. Now, my great-great-grandmother had a very different opinion. She determined to salvage as much of the cured meat as possible. And accordingly, she dispatched young Andrew when he got back from herding the livestock into the old level. She dispatched him with some kind of bag to go out and recollect the meat as it was lying in the dusty road. He returned to the farm where his mother watched and returned the food to the smokehouse. Now, this incident has been told and retold in my family, and the Yankees involved seldom get much credit for their zeal in conducting total war. But this story, I think, illustrates the way that the war came to us in the American Civil War, and it illustrates the ways in which the civilians respond, and the fact that this thing has endured through all the generations since then as local family lore, I think illustrates the prevalence of irregular warfare or war against resources in the Confederate experience. This is an overlong way of demonstrating that the American Civil War was antique, on its way to being modern, as in total war. It was many species of modern. And one way of understanding this is to focus upon the Commander-in-Chief, Jefferson Davis. That's the best I can do. I mean, I brought up here at least 3 books that speak to the, in one way or another, to the topic, but I think we won't read those all from here today. I believe that Jefferson Davis, and this is my way of attempting to focus here, believed that he could win this war despite the odds he knew were not in his favor. And I think Davis was rare among the generation of leaders that confronted this war in realizing what he was up against. I contend in, show the book, The Dogs of War, published last May, that Abraham Lincoln, although he was born in the South, married into the South, and had Southern experiences and relatives by marriage, never really understood the South or Southerners. He believed that they were just like his neighbors with whom he'd grown up in southern Indiana and southern Illinois, or middle central Illinois. Frontier farmers who would act out their economic interests and not follow the planter leadership into folly. And once they had realized the extent of their folly and lost the war, that they would be good candidates even to be good Republicans and turn on their planter leadership that had led them into destruction. This, of course, was 100 years off, but Lincoln was prescient in that. And other leaders, I think, were duped into believing that the war would not be a war, or would be short and restricted to one battle or one campaign, and would be primarily picnics and parades, and that the enemy wouldn't fight. All Yankees are pasty-faced cowards. Southerners are a degenerate species of cowards. Maybe in Davis's case, who I think did realize, because he had been in war himself, in the Mexican War, he'd been wounded at the Battle of Monterey, at Buena Vista, and participated in the Battle of Monterey. He'd been Secretary of War, and a good one. So maybe in Davis's case, it was all about honor and a prickly characteristic that compelled him to seek a court-martial in 1835 and debate the meaning of in court for several days. What does mean? That gives you some idea of Davis's sense of himself. Perhaps he had a sad romantic death wish, chose to go down in flames rather than wither away in impotence. But I believe that Davis thought he could win the war in the same way that his father and those of his father's generation had defeated Great Britain. Pre-modern war, as outlasting an enemy, like the partisans in the Carolina backcountry, who would snipe and steal and eventually lure the Yankees into Kings Mountain, and maybe even to Yorktown. But Davis began the war, or at least seeming, to try to defend every inch of southern soil, to create a cordon of defensive positions around his frontiers, which were significant, and believing that the Yankees, once they realized that his people were serious about this adventure, would leave them to it. But because the Yankees did not recoil and lose this first battle of wills, and persisted in prosecuting the war, Davis committed himself to modern war, that is, massed armies, industrial war, and his own version, self-styled nation building. Now, the first battle was an unbelievable victory at First Manassas or Bull Run, perhaps a missed opportunity to march on Washington and dictate terms of recognition of the Confederacy. I seriously doubt that that might have happened, but given Lincoln's will, but that's a possibility. There followed a winter of discontent in the Confederacy, in which these regular armies on Davis's frontier, arrayed in a cordon, suffered defeats. All I have to do is tick them off: Mill Springs, Fall of New Orleans, Roanoke Island, Pea Ridge, Shiloh, Cheat Mountain, and the loss of the Kanawha Valley, Port Royal nearby, New Madrid, Forts Henry and Donaldson. And to top that off, in the spring of '62, McClellan had 155,000 men arrayed in Washington about to march on Richmond and root out the rebellion. Now realize this is, Winfield Scott captured Mexico City with 5,000. This is more men than, now Napoleon had a couple 100,000 in his armies, but this is more men than any American had ever even thought about assembling at one time in one place. By the spring of 1862, it seemed only a matter of weeks before federal armies would put an end to anything resembling a Confederate government in Richmond and the Southern nation anywhere. Then desperation began to transform the Southern Republic. The Richmond government enacted, and this is some of the revolutionary, internal revolutionary aspects of this war, enacted the first draft law in North America, getting 1 year's head start on the United States. Suspended, had the authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and declare martial law, and in some cases, under the guise of martial law, to pass, or not just pass, but enact fixing of prices for goods in marketplaces in Richmond. Authorized the imposition of martial law and attempted a broad economic management to sustain the Union war effort. Indeed, the Italian historian of this war, Raimondo Luraghi, once compared the Confederates' industrial capacity to industrialize war industry as being the most rapid and most centrally controlled. The best example Luraghi could find was contemporary China in the Great Leap Forward, comparing that to the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis and Mao as soulmates. Eventually, among other adventures in statecraft, Davis and the Richmond government resorted to state socialism, that is, absolute government control of all foreign trade, attempting, in some measure, well, after the spring of 1862, the Confederates abandoned this defend every inch and create a cordon around the frontiers because they were unable to maintain those frontiers, and adopted the offensive defense, a Napoleonic Jominian exercise that involved allowing the enemy to penetrate southern borders, and then, in circumstances of the Confederates' choosing, when logistics, geography, and numbers favored the Southern Army, attack and destroy their enemy. This is what Robert E. Lee was attempting to do in the 7 days in June, July of 1862 in Second Manassas, or Second Bull Run, and with Ambrose Burnside's help at Fredericksburg and in Chancellorsville. P.G.T. Beauregard, ever the grand strategist, advocated a Western concentration to do the same thing, that is, to pounce on Union armies and destroy them. Beauregard led what became known as the Western Concentration Bloc among Confederate generals and politicians. Their principal activity was carping about whatever Jefferson Davis was trying to do as Commander-in-Chief. Among the advocates of the offensive defense was a subtle difference of emphasis, so subtle that most people and many historians didn't know that it existed. Lee especially emphasized the offense. He believed that only a decisive battle, the annihilation of a federal army, would produce victory. Hence, he invaded Maryland in September of 1862 and Pennsylvania in June of 1863. He also believed that this decisive battle had better come sooner rather than later, because he realized that Union armies were only going to go stronger, whereas he had limitations of manpower and resources. Davis and most American historians never grasped Lee's intentions to the degree to which he deceived Davis into believing that the President and the Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Commander of the Army of Northern Virginia were in perfect accord. Had Davis understood Lee's strategic intent, Lee probably would not have remained as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was well aware that the President was prickly about his honor and his prerogatives, and he knew all about the politics within the Confederate High Command. Lee could never win the decisive battle or annihilate an enemy army, and consequently, Confederate hopes hinged upon Davis's emphasis upon the defense in the offensive defensive. That is, husband resources and fight only when you can win. Davis, like George Washington and the Continental Congress, planned never to risk anything vital and to win a war of wills. Failing that, Davis was prepared to undertake a guerrilla phase of warfare and wage it as long as it took to wear down the Federals and achieve independence. Davis's final formal address to the people of his nation, written and maybe promulgated from Danville, Virginia, where his government was on wheels, in flight, on April 4th, 1865. Realize Richmond has fallen on the 2nd. Lee will surrender on the 9th. So things are, the war's not going well at this point. But Davis spoke about a new phase of the war. He and such officials of his government who chose to ride along, and not all of them did, together with the archives, the records and correspondence of the Confederate States, were in railroad cars. By this time, Joe Johnston and the other Confederate army of any consequence, the Army of Tennessee, the remnants of the Army of Tennessee, were nearing Durham, North Carolina. Davis said to however many people who read his address, and I doubt that many did, because how do you get the word spread, even if you can find somebody to print this thing? Words to the effect, we've got them now. Exactly where we want them. We have now, this is Davis, we have now entered a new phase of a struggle, the memory of which is to endure for all ages. Relieved from the necessity of guarding cities and particular points important but not vital to our defense, with an army free to move from point to point and strike in detail detachments and garrisons of the enemy, operating on in the interior of our own country, where supplies are more accessible and where the foe will be far removed from his own base and cut off from all succor in case of reverse. Nothing is now needed to render our triumph certain but the exhibition of our own unquenchable resolve. Let us but will it, and we are free. I think Davis may have been drifting off into some kind of netherworld. However, guerrilla tactics had been successful, as we heard yesterday, to some degree, and with the limitations that we heard about it too, in Spain, as in 1807, and of course they have become common in the recent past in various parts of the world in form of the Irish Republican Army, the Viet Cong, Al-Qaeda, and others. On April 25th, 1865, Davis went so far as to order Joe Johnston, remember he's at Durham, or near Durham, to disband his infantry and appoint a future rendezvous from which troops will continue the struggle. Johnston was to mount as many soldiers as possible as cavalry, move the draft horses from the artillery pieces, which of course they couldn't carry, and send them to Davis. Davis calculated that perhaps 5,000 troops would be available. With these, he proposed to ride west to meet Edmund Kirby Smith and his army, if they still exist, in the Trans-Mississippi sector. Johnston thought very briefly about this order from his commander-in-chief and then disobeyed it, surrendering to Sherman on the next day, April 26, 1865. Meanwhile, Davis continued his flight until a body of Federal cavalry overtook the small party that remained with the Confederate government and captured the president. the irony, or an irony among many, that this man who was so obsessed with his honor and concerned about appearances was captured wearing his wife's shawl and suffered the ignominy of being portrayed as a cross-dresser for the rest of his life. And so here we have a Confederacy that I would suggest was exhausted first and then defeated. Once upon a time, in the book that Tracy mentioned and from which he quoted, the most recent edition published by the University of South Carolina Press, reprinted, I argued that, or emphasized that the Confederacy was in itself an insurgency and conducted the war in such a fashion as to be qualified as such. But I've since backed off of that significantly. And in the Confederate Nation, hold up, latest reprint, here's a colorized version of the inauguration of Jefferson Davis. I argue that the fact that Confederates did not take up Davis's challenge to enter a new phase of the war and become guerrillas and melt into the countryside and fall upon the enemy who's deprived of his supplies from their long lines and all that. How are we going to supply those armies? They're going to fall on the enemy is not a question. Anyway, I oppose in Confederate Nation some alteration and suggest that the fact that Confederates, and by and large they did, even Wade Hampton, who once wrote to Davis that he would fight on forever and ever and he would command his cavalry as long as necessary to win independence, backed off. People like Nathan Bedford Forrest assembled his troops and said, I don't know what you guys are going to do, but I'm going home. It's over. And John Mosby, the gray ghost of Northern Virginia, did this precisely the same thing. He assembled his forces as well as he could and said, it's over, guys. We have to go home. Robert E. Lee presented the opportunity in a day or so before Appomattox, suggested that he could not do such a thing as to become like partridges and rabbits, as his questioner or proposer suggested, that he was too old for that. And his reasons were that we couldn't really win that way, at least win in the way that Lee proposed to win. He was a little bit more afraid of anarchy than he was Yankees. The men would be under no control of officers, he wrote, or said. And that the enemy would inflict more damage on the countryside than has already happened, and enough had already happened that Lee knew well. So I suggest that the fact that Confederates rejected the guerrilla option was, in a sense, an affirmation of Southern culture at its most basic level. This I'm quoting from the new preface to Confederacy, the revolutionary experience. They affirmed that culture of the folk, the primacy of people and place over institutions and abstracts, that perhaps best defined them as a people, having sacrificed or been willing to sacrifice most of the ideological tenets they went to war to defend. Ultimately, Confederates, remember, authorized the recruitment of African American troops in the Confederate Army. The law passed by the Confederate Congress in March of 1865, a little late, said nothing in this act shall alter the relationship between master and slave. But everybody knew that this was emancipation. If you bring African Americans into the Confederate Army, they're not going to be slaves anymore. I mean, picture this. The waters part, the heavens open, the Confederates win with the efforts of black troops. What lieutenant is going to go out there, and it's going to be a lieutenant, I know, and say, okay, to a black regiment, okay guys, stack your arms, pick up hoes and pitchforks and shuffle on off to the cotton fields. That's not going to happen. This is about emancipation. Also, remember, in the 19th century and still, but particularly in the 19th century, lots of folks believed that service as a warrior, fighting for one's country and homeland, was the highest expression of manhood. And this is a sacred fraternity of people who do these things. Now, we've gotten a little bit away from that, but not that far. And in the 19th century, they adhered to this. And if they're willing to admit African Americans into this sacred fraternity, it says some things about how far the government, at least, and a lot of influential commanders, Lee and Johnston included, were willing to go in order to pursue independence, and how far they were willing to depart from a lot of the racial assumptions that had brought this war to occur in the first place. Ultimately, Confederate Southerners were willing to lose their national life in order to save life itself. And there is a follow-up to my great-great-grandmother's smokehouse story. If I can find it. The Yankees came back to Chestnut Grove. Remember, they were the ones who broke into the smokehouse and stole the ham and hams and bacon and run off, and my great-great-grandfather had to go pick them up, or great-grandfather. Well, they returned to Chestnut Grove in March of 1978 as part of training exercises conducted by 2 battalions of the 82nd Airborne. About 1,000 airborne troopers in maroon berets, shouldering 60-pound packs, trudged past the farm near the end of a 33-mile forced march. Led by a full colonel who wore his academy ring where some people wear a wedding band, the soldiers were intense and impressive. During the exercise, they covered almost 100 miles in 3 days. This is according to newspaper accounts. A performance which ranks with Stonewall Jackson's foot cavalry. Although the comments of some of the troopers regarding the march may have offended a few genteel ears among those who stood by on the roadsides, and many did, to watch this procession these Yankees were quite well behaved. Not only did they stay away, they did march right down the road from the farm, 200 yards from the house. Not only did they stay away from the smokehouse at Chestnut Grove, they even left some food to replace that they had taken many years before. After the troops had passed, my father, in the course of doing some bush hogging along the road, found a very small olive drab tin can. And if the label is accurate, the can contains jam, 849, net weight 1.5 ounces. During the 1860s, the Yankee Army came to Chestnut Grove and rode away with sides of bacon and Virginia hams. Just over 100 years later, the Yankees came back and left an ounce and a half of apricot jam. That, I think, is progress. The next time, maybe they'll leave some hairspray and chocolates and perhaps even iPads. Who knows? Thank you very much. We're on it. Am I backing away as the Confederacy as an insurgency? No, I'm not. No, I think it was, and it was, I think the Civil War fascinates people for all manner of reasons. And one fascination is this juncture of modernity, being trapped in part by their enemies into an industrial modern war fought with large armies and conventional, well, somewhat conventional battles, primarily on the land. And all the while anticipating, and Davis even proclaiming, a postmodern war, a insurgent guerrilla partisan campaign. I still believe that the activities of Confederate raiders on the high seas with Raphael Semmes in the lead and others were in some ways sort of patriotic piracy, which qualifies as high seas insurgency. And obviously you have the work of John Mosby in Virginia, capturing a Yankee general and wreaking havoc behind the enemy lines. And that was even ultimately endorsed by Lee, the conventional commander. And for a long time, Lee thought that was a waste. What are these guys doing? We need them in the Stuart's cavalry. But about the time Stuart was killed, or mortally wounded, at Yellow Tavern in spring of '64, Lee changed his mind and lauded Mosby for his efforts and believed that the most vulnerable part of the enemy, as Mosby said, was his rear. And obviously Forrest is an example of hit-and-run tactics by a regular commander. That is, Forrest, to the degree that Forrest could be regular, was in the Army and sometimes acted in concert with his cavalry, sometimes acted in concert with the infantry, even though he stormed into Braxton Bragg's tent one time and told him to go to hell. And if he repeated some action that Bragg had done, that Forrest would cheerfully kill him. Forrest did cooperate with large conventional forces. I think that my emphasis would be on the fact that once the lines down and the Confederacy is first exhausted and then defeated, they stay defeated and they don't go into a guerrilla phase. Realize here that the guerrilla phase, this violates the whole Mao formula, which nobody quite anticipated, that you first operate as guerrillas and then you coalesce into main force units and fight, a la the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, regular army. The Confederate experience would violate that, but the Confederates did not. And one thing that interests me is that they did not dissolve into a war that still goes on. I mean, yes, you see Forget Hell and you got Rick Perry and all those folks talking about seceding again, but I don't think they're serious. I hope not. And you don't have the Confederates sticking around like the IRA, which has been bombing for a long time. And other insurgencies that are at least defeated and then but keep the faith, as Davis would prescribe. They didn't. The overwhelming majority of Southerners acknowledged that, hey, it's over. Now we're about to hear that the Ku Klux Klan and other activities in the Reconstruction, that this was what Davis had envisioned about keeping the faith. But notice that Davis is not involved with that. And Lee certainly wasn't. And other Confederate leaders, Johnson and other conventional commanders, were not involved in a lot of this irregular activity. And one might argue, I do, that the failure of Reconstruction, that is to reconstruct, to construct all over again, to remake the Confederate South, was not so much didn't happen so much because of Confederate resistance, of Southern resistance, Southern white resistance, and the Ku Klux Klan, and we can talk about this in the next session, but I think a lot of it had to do with the collision of 19th century industrial capitalism with humanitarian reform, i.e. The emancipation of slavery. Now, during the war, those two facts, that is industrial capitalism, the growth thereof, and the effort to free African Americans, they complemented each other in the United States. They fueled the war effort. In Reconstruction, however, I think they come into conflict. If you're going to, what are you going to do with the new freedmen? What they desperately need is economic assistance. These people are penniless. A logical thing, and something that was proposed over and over again, was to confiscate the property of the planter class that had led the Confederacy and redistribute that to African Americans, 40 acres and a mule. And there were acts presented, acts presented to Congress to do just that. However, the United States Congress, in its wisdom, didn't do that. Because, and this is my interpretation, if property is not sacred in Charleston, then is it going to be sacred in Boston or New York or Philadelphia? You can't mess with the sanctity of property.